Okay, today I want to talk to you about something that came up in class once again. I teach English, so things come up. And today we were talking, actually, the topic of the discussion, the topic of the lesson, was guns and gun control. And talking to this student, it occurred to me that everything I hear about guns and gun control in the United States, and that's what I want to address specifically, is from an American perspective. Now, I've lived outside of the United States for many years, and I've lived in several countries, and this issue seems to be fairly well known worldwide. So I want to address this from a global perspective, not from just an American perspective. Americans take it very personally for various reasons, and people that I talk to uh, in other countries have their own opinions. But a lot of their opinions are based on a lack of information. Where does this opinion come from? America has too many guns. The United States has too many shootings, and it's because they have guns. Everybody has a gun. That's not wrong, but it's a little oversimplified. So, yeah, I wanted to talk about that today and try to address a more global audience than just the United States. Because what they do is they try to get people on one side or the other. And I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to give some information and a little bit of my own perspective, which means opinions. But you got to remember, I don't live in the United States. So, you know, but I do have a lot of information because I'm from there. So let's start with, why do Americans have guns? Why is that legal? All right. Let's start with the law as it was originally written in 1780, whatever. I don't remember when. It was after the what's it called? The Revolutionary War. It's called in America, against the British, as it's called in the United States. I shouldn't say America. Canada and Mexico had little to do with it, at least at the time. So let's look at the law as it was written when the United States was first becoming a country. Here's the Second Amendment. Now, amendment to what? It's an amendment to the Constitution. All right, hang on. The Constitution was a document that described the new government as they were proposing to the different colonies. Well, they were no longer colonies, they were states. They were independent, autonomous states, which is why they're still called states today. So they're trying to convince these different states to join a union to form one country. And they introduced this document, the Constitution, that described the government, but it didn't really address the problems of the rights of the people and the rights of the individual states. Would these states be giving up their autonomy to a federal government? No, they were not. They had no intention of doing that. And so every single state just refused to sign the Constitution. No one would join, and it wasn't really a mystery why. There was no guarantees against a monarchy or a military dictatorship or something like that. So they came up with something they called the Bill of Rights, and it was 10 separate amendments in this one document, the Bill of Rights, that gave states and individuals certain rights, hence the name. So let's go back and look at the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's dense, old-fashioned English. It's a complex sentence, and it's a little hard to understand, partially because of the sentence structure and partially because of the vocabulary. Now, I want to address the vocabulary first of all, because there's one particular word that a lot of people don't really understand, not clearly. And I'm not talking about non-native English speakers. I'm talking about native English speakers, even in the United States. They don't know what this word means exactly. So let's get into that. What is a militia? Militia is a military force that is needed from the civil population. Military force that is raised from the civil population to supplement a regular army in an emergency. That's the basic meaning of the word. And in a historical context in the United States, which we need because this is an historical document, it is all able-bodied citizens eligible by law to be called on to provide military service supplementary to the regular armed forces. Supplementary to the regular armed forces. Now, what you need to understand is at the very beginning of this fight, there were no regular armed forces. You had colonies. You had British colonies relying on the British military to defend them. And now you start getting these colonies wanting to get away from British rule. And many, 13, of these colonies agreed, and they wanted to throw off the military rule of Britain. Well, they didn't have a standing army. They weren't unified. So what did they do? Well, what do you have at this point? Let's say 1774, 73, 72, for the entire 1700s. You have these colonies, and they have to defend themselves. Britain defends them from foreign invaders, but how do you defend your town against the native population, the Indians? How do you defend them from groups of people attacking your town to take over or something like that? They form militias. They have guns. Why do they have guns? Hunting. They got to find food for their families. And so they form these militias, these bands of people to to hunt, maybe to hunt together, to defend their town. Sometimes the militias grew big enough to defend the entire colony, possibly against other colonies, who knows? And so you have these militias. They're not regular army. They don't belong to any government. They're independent militias. That's what a militia is. So what happens? You have the colonies as a group trying to fight against the British rule. And how do they do that? They don't have an army. Now, of course, the French came in aid, and a whole bunch of other countries came in aid with money or weapons or whatever. The French came in to help them fight and help them train their military. But, I mean, before that happens, the fight starts. And so how do they do that? They bring in the militias, and they get them to work together. They train them to work together. They train them to fight. And at the same time, this became kind of a continental congress, is what they eventually became called. Wasn't a government yet, but it was a congress of representatives from all the colonies that wanted to take part of this. And they eventually were able to raise a continental army. In the meantime, you had this militia, this giant militia from all these other colonies. So that helped a lot. I mean, it helped more than a lot. This isn't a history lesson on that, but that's where that comes from, and that's what the word means. And then the French came in and all this, and in the end of the day, the United States. Well, it wasn't the United States. It was these United North American colonies won their independence against Britain. Okay, so when it came to trying to unite the colonies into one country, they failed until they came up with this Bill of Rights, and they came up with the Second Amendment. And so we've seen the Second Amendment, and it still seems dense. You know what a militia is. So what does this sentence mean? All right, I tried writing it into more modern English, and I came up with this. Because a reliable militia is necessary to the security of a free country, the right of the people to own and carry weapons, at the time of the writing mostly defined as guns and knives, shall not be fucked with under any circumstances. You can keep your guns. Please keep your guns. We are relying on you to keep your guns. And, be kind of cool if you remain skilled at using them. But that's the historical context. That's why that amendment was put in there. And here's the thing. They were talking about their own time. But if they had a time machine, or if they could look into the future and see what would happen, they would not have changed that amendment by one word. They would not have changed a single comma. For two reasons. Number one, because they didn't trust standing armies. A standing army meaning a professional group of soldiers, a professional group of fighting people who are loyal to the government that hired them and is paying them. This is what they were fighting against in the first place. That's number one. Number two, they would see what people were doing now, using the weapons to defend themselves. They might see the school shootings, but they would also see the context under which those things were happening, and I'll get to that in a minute. So that's the historical context. That's the reason for that amendment. And there you go. Now you've got a lot of people saying that these days we don't really need a militia. We've got one of the most powerful militaries on the planet. We don't need a militia. We have a standing army now. Well, okay, number one, yeah, it's a standing army in the service of the government that it's serving. Well, what if we don't like where that government goes? How do we defend against that? What if Donald Trump had turned into a dictator like Hitler or Mussolini? We'd have no defense against that. America does. The United States, they've got guns. They've got access to ammunition. This isn't a problem for them. So, there's that. But also, that's what people see. They see in the news, they see these shootings. These kids come in and shoot up a school and kill all these students. It's a tragedy. Where did they get the guns? Why do we have guns? Why are guns available? Make guns unavailable. Okay, yeah, fair enough. That kind of makes sense. It kind of makes sense if you don't really think about it. But here's the problem. Now I want to discuss my understanding of human nature. You may or may not agree with me on this, but my experience with people, and I've got extensive experience with different people in different countries, and what I'm about to say crosses all cultures, all age levels. Okay? Number one, most people are good. People are good. They don't want to hurt anybody. They don't want anybody to get hurt. They want peace. They want their freedom. And they want that for everyone else around them. That's most people. I believe that. The problem is there are other issues. Human nature. People are also really violent. I mean, look at history. People are violent. People who are not violent are fighting their natural, instinctual tendencies. I believe that too. And most people do. Most people do fight against those violent tendencies. But they do have those tendencies. They tend to be violent. That's a human thing. We're a violent species. And we are a species. We are an animal. So it's helpful to be aware of that. Because we have our own instincts. We have our own tendencies as a species. So don't forget the fact that we're animals too. Another problem that humans have is that we are generally, this is a generalization. The last two were not generalizations. This one is a generalization. People tend to be preternaturally stupid. I'm not even going to argue this point. People are just bone stupid. Most people. Almost all. That's a problem. And we also tend to be very selfish. And these things can be fought against. But a problem with the selfishness and the stupidity, we tend towards confirmational bias. So we come up with opinions and ideas, and what we do is we ignore information that contradicts those biases. Biases? I should know this, but I don't. Well, anyway, we should look for information that contradict our ideas, but we don't. What we do is we search for information that confirms it, and we reject and ignore anything that goes against what we believe. This is because we don't learn to think critically. People are either incapable of or unwilling to engage in critical thinking. Why? I don't know. Laziness? That's another human trait. But we're not taught to engage in critical thinking by our educational system. We're not taught by our parents because our parents were not taught by their parents. We're not taught to think critically. We're taught to believe the authority figures. This is why propaganda works so well. This is why so many people in Russia support Putin. And why so many people in China support Xi Jinping, and why so many people in the United States support Trump. There's plenty of information out there that tells us why these people do not deserve our support, but they keep getting it because people believe the propaganda and they don't want to think critically, and they already have these ideas based on propaganda or their parents or their education or whatever, and so they don't think critically, so they just believe that, and their confirmation bias perpetuates that over generation and generation and generation, and this is why this keeps fucking happening. This is why the Russia was able to invade Ukraine, and we allow it, and the Russian people allow it. That's going off on another tangent. Let's just say that this is why people are the way they are, but that makes it very, very difficult to change the status quo. And the status quo in the United States is everybody can have a gun. Almost everybody can have a gun. You can't have a gun if you're a convicted felon. Even if you finished your prison sentence, you can't have a gun because you were a convicted felon. Oh, you can get a gun. Not legally, but you can get a gun. But it's not a legal issue. And again, that goes back to why we can't repeal the Second Amendment. People have guns. A lot of good people have guns. You take away guns from the good people, you're just going to piss them off, and they're not going to give you your guns. And now you've made an enemy. And then the bad guys have guns, and that's the only people who have guns are enemies of the state. Either bad guys from the beginning or newly formed enemies. There's no way around it. So, and I also, one more thing before I go, I want to point out that Switzerland has as many guns per capita as the United States, or close to it, something like that. They don't have the problems that the United States have because, a couple of things. They don't have the melting pot. They don't have this huge mixture of cultures. That's slowly changing, and we'll see what happens in Switzerland as a result of that. But another reason is it's a lot smaller. And one more reason is it's got a long history of being a neutral country, and they are relying on the people as well as their own army to defend the country for its neutrality. They have a lot more unity. They have a lot less disenfranchisement that the U.S. has. Again, that may be changing, and I'm watching Switzerland with high hopes they manage it. But it's going to need management. We'll see how that goes. But anyway, that's the information I have about the Second Amendment and why the United States has so many guns. And I'm going to call that a night. And I'm going to have to bid you. Whoops, that's not right. Thanks for watching.